Hi there, my name is Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about my vacation. I was gone for 10 days and did not have access to a sewing machine, but I did take my computer along with me. While I was gone, I decided to make some patterns for teapots. So I made a dozen teapot foundation paper piece patterns. I've also got a pattern here printed out for a bucket hat. So I'm gonna try to make that in the next week or two as well. But today, let's get started with the teapot and see what we can make happen. Well, here is a look at the pattern. There's page 1 that shows the image as I created it on the computer, and then page 2 has the instructions and the individual sections. And last, there are a few pages that have the individual sections pattern pieces. The first step that I take when doing a foundation piece pattern, I cut apart all my sections. The section with the middle of the teapot would be a great spot to maybe do fussy cutting. Perhaps you have some kind of cool floral print, or maybe Spider-Man, or whatever you want on your teapot. That one big piece, you could fussy cut something. My next step is to cut out fabrics for every section and create my groups. Now I have this layer cake leftover. It's one leftover 10-inch square that came out of a layer cake, and I never used it, so I was thinking this would be cute for that center of the teapot. And I thought, well, what if that little lacy white line with the red stripes was at the top, and then this pretty flower was in the middle of the teapot? So I am going to try and cut out this one piece of fabric to be the focal point of my teapot. I also had another 10-inch square out of that same layer cake pack, and I'm going to use some of that for the rest of the teapot. For the gold accents on this teapot, I chose this gold fabric from my stash. I just need a little tiny bit of it. I had this blue and this purple fabric in my stash, and I thought one of them might make good background fabric for this teapot, and I chose the purple. Just note that some of the filters I use on my video make it look like I picked the blue. I slowed down a little bit of this video. I am going to start cutting out fabric for every section. I'm going to start with that focal front of my teapot. Now, when your pattern piece is right side up, your fabric needs to be right side down. I cut out my piece of fabric for the main part of the teapot, and I am leaving plenty of seam allowance here. Then I'm cutting out 4 little squares of my purple, and those are going to be the corners of that teapot. The next section I slowed down is the bottom of the teapot. I'm cutting out a gold rectangle for the bottom, and then just some little background pieces that go around that base of the teapot, and then one large rectangle that is a big section of the block, but it's just the background fabric. Next, I cut out the little gold accent sections along with their pieces of background or teapot fabric. And you can see I cut these fabrics with the right side of the fabric facing down. That way I make sure I have a large enough piece to cover that section plus seam allowance. The last section I'm going to slow down for you is the bottom of the teapot spout. So I need one piece of my beautiful floral print and then just the pieces of background fabric that will go around that spout. With all my sections stacked up, I'm ready to sew. When you're doing foundation paper piecing, it's really helpful to have a bright light source nearby. In my case, I've got a pretty bright light in the throat of my machine plus a lamp back behind my machine. So I can see these fabrics through the paper. I can see if I'm covering up the stitch line that I'm going to be stitching on. To start, I've got piece 1, which is my floral print, and I'm looking for a background piece, piece 2, and my print 1 is right side down. Then I'm going to put this piece 2 right sides together with that piece 1, and I'm going to make sure the edges of both of those cover up that stitch line between piece 1 and piece 2. So it looks like I've got plenty of leeway here. That floral print is covering the whole piece of piece 1, and that purple, when it's opened up after I stitch the line, it will cover piece 2. Now I've got my stitch length set to 1.5 here because that will make it easy to tear the paper away. It makes a nice perforation on the paper that I'm using. After every addition, I do trim away the excess thread first. It's easy to get that thread caught up in the next piece, so I make sure and trim after every addition. Next, I am going to fold the paper on the stitch line that I just sewed, and I'm going to trim away the bulk to about 1/4 inch or a little closer if you feel comfortable. Then I'm going to press open my seam. Now it's time to add piece 3, which is also a background piece. Now I cut out something that's a little bit larger than I need. That's okay though. And I'm going to line this up right sides together. I'm going to make sure the edges of what's overhanging on piece 2 and what I'm now laying down with piece 3, make sure those overhang that stitch line that I'm going to be sewing. Once I stitch that seam line, I go ahead and trim those threads again. Then I fold back the paper on the line I just sewed, trim away the excess, then I press that seam open. Now it's time to add the last piece to this section. You can see that I cut this to size, and I cut it a little bit larger than I needed, but what I like to do is make sure that angle that I need to add this piece to matches my fabric. So now I've got that angle right sides together with the previously sewn pieces, 1, 2, and 3, and I'm making sure that that angle line overhangs the line that I need to sew. Once that looks good to me, I go ahead and stitch that line between piece 3 and piece 4. Then I trim the thread. Then I fold back the paper on the line I just stitched and trim away the excess bulk. Then I press the seam open. And I make sure and set aside any scraps that are big enough for me to reuse in another project. Those go into my scrap bin. I usually go ahead and stitch all my sections, and the last thing I will do is trim them to the seam allowance line. Well, I'm not going to make you watch me put together every single section. I did slow it down for this last one though, the center of the teapot. I've got that pretty floral print with that lacy border, and it was a little bit tricky lining it up because you have to put the right side down, but having a bright light nearby was really helpful, so I got that lined up just the way I wanted it, and then all I had to do was stitch on those 4 corners of background fabric. I stitched on 2 corners at one time, then I trimmed my thread, then I trimmed away the excess bulk, then I went ahead and stitched on the rest of the corners. I probably could have stitched on all 4 corners at one time because they are not touching each other, so there's nothing that says you can't just stitch them all on at the same time. Kind of like snowballing a quilt block. With all the sections put together, it's time to trim to that seam allowance line. So I'm going to be using a ruler for some of these sections, the ones that have loose floppy ends. I like to lay down on a cutting mat and use a ruler. For smaller pieces that are not floppy and I feel comfortable holding in my hand, I will just trim those with a pair of scissors. This teapot is making me very happy. Anyway, I wanted to show you a sample of a smaller piece that I just held in my hand to trim. This is one of those gold accent pieces. So you can see on a small piece like this, you can just hold it in your hand and do the trimming. Once all those sections are trimmed up, it's time to follow the instructions and put this block together. So we've got 3 main sections, and section 1 is piece A plus B, then we're going to add C, then we're going to add D, and we're going to have 3 main sections. After we get all done, put those together and our teapot will be done. I keep my instructions handy, I keep my section map handy, and I keep the picture of the teapot handy. And that is because I'm going to take my pieces for the first section, which is A, B, C, and D, and I'm going to lay those kind of right sides up so I can make sure this looks right and looks like my picture. This section is the teapot spout. So the first thing I need to do is stitch A and B together. Now I check my little picture to see if there's anything that needs to match up, and there is. And you can see I'm doing a little circle here. These are the joints, or joins, whatever you want to call them, where pieces on this section need to match up. And I'm very firm user of clips, so I will put these 2 pieces right sides together along that seam line. I'm going to get my clips out and I'm going to put some tentative clips on there, and I call them tentative because I open this up, I take a look at where this 1/4 inch seam is going to be, and if I need to adjust, now's the time. I normally only finger press before adding the next piece of this section. So next we're going to be adding piece C, but if I add PC without taking off some of this paper, some of those little pieces of paper are going to become encased in a total of 3 seams, and I'll never get them out. So I pull off some of the paper before I add my next piece. Sometimes the paper just seems to want to come off. In those cases, I don't worry about it too much. I'm going to be using those clips that have a 1/4 inch line anyway. And also I'm going to be repositioning if I need to match up sections of my teapot. Okay, and the last piece we're going to add to this section is D, which is the teapot spout, and that does need to get lined up with the top part of the spout. And you can see I'm using clips. I'm lining up both sides first, and I'm going ahead and putting all the clips in, and then I'm checking up on what is matching, perhaps if there's anything I need to reposition. Now we've got part 1 done. I'm going to go ahead and take off all this paper. I'm not going to need it to attach the other 2 units. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it now and finger press this seam open, and then I'll be getting the second section and the third section completed. If you're foundation paper piecing and you've got some small pieces like these little gold accents, you'll probably want to have some tweezers handy. When you take that paper off, there are going to be some very tiny pieces. I slowed down this part. You can see here I'm putting section 2 and section 3 together. That's the teapot handle. And I do use those clips extensively to make sure where I need those things to line up, they actually do line up. And then last I put on that section 1, the teapot spout, and then I can take this to the iron and press it nice and flat. This pattern is for a 12-inch block, and it does look like it fits under my 12.5-inch ruler just right, so good on me. And here is my finished teapot. I just love it. I think it's cute. This is the first of 12. I've designed a total of 12, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I do hope to see you back again real soon.